The opinions expressed are those of the host and guests of this program and are not necessarily those of station staff, management, or sponsors. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. It's time to Ask a Rabbi. Call in with your questions and comments at 340-1590. And now, here's your host, Rabbi Shafir Lobb. And Rabbi Lobb, we played the whole song today.
There we go. We got to listen to great music. For those who are not in the studio, and when you see it on YouTube, you'll chuckle. We were untangling a wire that kind of like knocked the live stream phone down and a bunch of other little things. So, all right. Anyway, good morning. Please do give me a call at 772-340-1590. And for those of you who are concerned by the little frog in my throat, that's the joy of having postnasal drip and lecturing every single day this week.
Oh, it's heavy on the pollen, too. Did you see Durham, South Carolina? Was it North Carolina? Durham?
Yeah. And I
one of those Carolina.
Yeah, and I am one who does
Their
not do
air is
well.
totally like green-yellow. I mean, just everything is heavy on the pollen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And certainly the trees are responding in the area. So all of that stuff is acting up and making the we'll hope the voice carries for the hour. So you need to call in and ask a question so I can listen for a minute here and there. That'll help. And today I was going to talk a little bit. Somebody asked last week, what was a Seder? And so I'm going to talk some more about what is a Seder and why you might want to join us next week. We've got a public Seder on Friday and Saturday, and we do still have some seats available. Feel free to give us a call at the temple and make a reservation. It's $36 for an adult and lower rates, and there's a family cap and things like that. So the idea is not to make it unaffordable, but it is not an inexpensive meal to prepare. There's a lot there. There's brisket, there's fish, there's chicken, and there's vegan options as well. So lots of really good food. It's an excellent meal. Plus there's a whole bunch of ritual items, and I'm sure that Stuart will chime in here shortly and remind people that we do throw things during it.
Like frogs, like the Aaron
like
throat.
frogs, yeah, because, there were plagues.
I thought you had the frogs because you were preparing for Passover.
Sometimes I do, but not in my throat.
Depends on how I throw it.
Yeah, I understand. There you go. So we do remind people to close their mouths. What can I say? Just imagine what it must have been like for Pharaoh and everybody in Egypt having frogs all over the place, going squish on them. It's like yuck. And people who experience animal migrations going through their towns can probably relate to some of those ideas. So back to the Seder. We talked a little bit about it last week, and we talked about why Jesus' Last Supper could not have been a Seder. And some of the biggest reasons on that one are pretty straightforward. One, Passover can never start on a Thursday night.
well, how do we know what day the Last Supper was? Do we know?
Well, if the going to the grave and rising was on, actually we do, because the crucifixion is on Friday.
Okay.
Right, so there's a discussion about Friday and the guards being impatient because the Sabbath is coming. So, yeah, so there's that. So we know that happened on a Friday. And that actually is part of why Sunday for Easter is a challenge, because it's not 3 days. Right? Friday to Sunday is not 3 days, no matter how you slice it. So there are some challenges, and there often are in sacred story when you get down into details like that. They're not meant to be examined in that way. Mm-hmm. They're just not designed for that. They're meant to teach something. The other reason is if we listen to the book of John, which says that Jesus is crucified when the lambs are being slaughtered, it's hard to have eaten them the night before. It's just a challenge, right? After you eat it, it's really hard to walk into the temple and be slaughtered. I'm sorry, You know, it doesn't work that way. Yeah. So, one of the things that I'll tell you in my ethics class that we're talking about is cloned meat. The meat that they're now growing in test tubes, right? Because that never was a live animal, right? It's taken from cells, and the cells are grown into meat. And now they're actually, there's an Israeli firm that is making it into steaks and really workable. So in a number of years, we'll be able to have meat that does not come from cows directly. Now, it comes from cow cells, but it's not a baby cow that's been slaughtered or an adult cow that's been slaughtered. So no animals have been harmed in the production of this food.
Does that make all cloned food kosher?
Well, it's an interesting point. The chief rabbi of Israel said that cloned pork, excuse me, is not pork. So, yeah.
I still don't want to taste it.
See, I didn't know that we've gotten past the cloning where they just
Create a sheep.
where
No, they're actually growing.
a sheep carries the baby and it.
Yeah, that's one level of it. That's
I'm
fertilizing.
like, that's just different way
Yeah.
of doing it the old-fashioned way. Just.
Yeah, well, one is growing a new baby,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's taking
Right.
an egg and sperm
Right.
and growing it
Right. And calling it a duplicate.
and calling it well, it is a duplicate. I mean, it's a replicative.
But to me, all
creation.
sheep look alike anyway.
We won't even start that.
Such discrimination there.
I know.
There's a reason for that. There's a natural tendency for people to view the out group.
I mean,
as
you know that
looking
there are
alike.
people who are cloning their dogs because they love this dog so much they want to
Another
have that.
version,
Yeah, but to me, it's like, it is another version,
Yeah.
and it's going to grow up to be a different dog because
'cause
it's
it's
going to
gonna
have
have-
different experiences. So it's kind of crazy. Just
Yeah. Well, that idea, right? So when you do that, the idea is not understanding the role of nurture, right, and the experiences and how that shapes who you are. And we are so shaped by what happens when we're babies, whether it's human babies or animal babies. Huge impacts in how we're in that first couple of years. Really just sets a lot of the tone, and it overrides a lot of the biology. So yeah, so the folks that are
how does it
cloning
fit
their
in with
pets,
religion?
what
The
cloning?
cloning.
So it's not illegal, it's not improper, it's not immoral. You're just growing food stuff, right? It just happens to be the proteins are that of meat. And that's the argument that the chief rabbi uses in Israel to say it's not really a pig, it's just protein grown.
Yeah, because it's never been a pig.
It's never been a
It's not
pig.
experienced one thing
Right, of
that
being
that
a-
animal would have
Well,
experienced.
it hasn't experienced anything.
Yeah.
All it's done is unconscious protein growing in a dish. Right.
Which is kind of creepy to me.
Yeah, well-
even as food.
And that is, that, if you will, is what the scientists say is going to be the hardest barrier to pass, is that factor, right? That people go, that doesn't seem natural. Well, it may not be natural, but the wheat that we're growing is not natural either. It's not wild, right? We've cultivated. It's just the next natural progression in cultivation. And it's much cleaner. It doesn't produce all of the greenhouse gases. It's just right now it happens to be horribly expensive, right? So a piece of steak that's the size of a credit card is in the hundreds of dollars. So they've got to bring that cost down. And there are some breakthroughs.
Or
that
just do
are
it the
happening.
old-fashioned way. I mean,
Well, no, it's actually very inefficient to raise a cow.
but it's worked for our entire existence.
But it's not working for the population size we have today. That's the challenge.
Oh, we have too many people then.
Well, we do. Well, and that was the argument, of course, that Hitler used, right? He said, and I'm not even beginning to compare your comment in that way.
Well, it's probably because of our scientific breakthroughs too.
The breakthroughs that we're doing, the things that we're doing, yeah. So,
It's her last day. She's on her way out.
All right, understand. So, and I lost my thought with that too. We've
Well,
gotten to the place now.
Vaccines, medicine, there's all kinds of different scientific things that have prolonged the life of humans. So we
Right.
do have more humans on the planet.
Well, yeah, we absolutely do, right? The life expectancy around the 1900s was late 40s. Life expectancy when Social Security started was in the early 60s. Right, the system was designed to never actually pay out.
Mm-hmm.
It was designed to collect money, and then you'd keel over a year or two after you quit working, and it wouldn't. And the 6-month delay until they started, blah blah, was designed to never really pay you. Yeah. What can I say? And here we are. We're living now into the hundreds. I was just talking with somebody whose mother just turned 99. Right. So.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. And the expectation is that not only do we live into the 99s and the hundreds, but we live still functioning. Right. It's not like we're stuck in a wheelchair or in a bed. We're living longer. We're living healthier. We're living a more full life. And part of that is the joy of medicine and treating bacteria. But if we don't watch ourselves with that, we're going to create the real superbugs. And I mean, food is one of the really big issues throughout our history, and how we deal with it. Whether it was biblically and how you dealt with it then. In those days, the animals were pretty much free to roam, and you just kind of like kept them in. You might pen them in a little bit, and now we've gone to matrix, right? Food processing operations. To call that a farm is not quite accurate. It's designated as a farm, but it's really not. It's a super intense. The animal's highly medicated
Well,
to grow
it's
fast.
commercialized.
It's
It's
very
more like a
commercialized.
factory
Yeah,
than
it's a
just
it's a
yeah.
food factory,
Mhm.
and the cows and sheep and
That's
fish.
that's the product.
That's the product,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily easy for them. They're not free range.
Sure, and it's will come back on us as well. I mean, if we're feeding kibble to fish that would normally eat other fish in the wild,
Yeah.
by the time we eat it, it's something different.
And it is. It was an interesting. I did that cruise in December, and one of the things that was on that boat was America's Best Kitchen or something like that, and they were talking about cooking salmon, and it was really interesting because they one of the sidebar discussions was the difference in wild caught salmon and farm salmon, and they actually have two very different ways of being cooked because the flesh of the fish is so different.
Wow.
If it's been farmed, it's much fatter. It doesn't have the tone of the
Mhm.
fiber, and so it cooks differently. And if you try to cook wild salmon that way, it'll be tough and dry, and
Sure.
yeah. So you've got to really cook them differently because you've got to handle all that extra fat.
Sure, and the farmed fish were kept in captivity. They didn't
Yeah.
swim
Right.
around in circles. That's probably all they did.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
just kind of like sat there, and they actually live in a dirtier environment, right? Because the water's not free flowing. That's not to say that they don't try to clean the tanks and keep things going, but there's other issues, and the same is true with the dense cattle packing in a matrix operation. It's creating other problems, and one of the biggest causes of environmental issues, the rising temperature, is bovine gas, right? So, on how somebody measured that, I don't even want to think about it. But that is one of it's the methane, right, that comes from that has a lot to do. And I guess they can just measure what it is over a matrix versus what it is just in the open air and have some idea of what's happening. So there's a lot at play here. And I was also going to talk earlier when we had the Black Plague that came through Europe. I mean, it wiped out huge amounts of population, but the survivors were actually better off for food. They had ample food supply. That was one of the times where we were bumping up against what we were able to produce for food, And in a funny kind of way, that actually played into some of the susceptibility, like the morbidity of the plague, how many people were going to come down with it and not be able to resist it because they didn't have ample food. And so eating a healthy diet is important. The other thing with this lab-grown meat is you can actually control how much fat it's going to have. It does have fat. The cells differentiate into meat fiber, into fat, and all of the different parts because they're stem cells out of a cow. Okay.
And no bone, because then there would be no waste either,
Right.
because there would be
Exactly.
that would have no structure. It would
Right.
be no bone.
And so that's one of the
But
challenges.
that means we can't make soup.
Can't make soup the same way. Can make soup a different way. Can always make soup. Yeah, that's one of those things that I probably need to be sucking on with this voice. Is a little bit of soup. That does help. And you can make soup with real meat. I've made it with chicken meat without the bones too. So soup makes quite well. And I make a vegetarian soup. So a vegan soup. So we're in this stage where we're creating food differently, and we need to. We need to come up with a green way to make food, a way that's environmentally friendly, and the lab-grown meat meets that criteria, and it's passed the taste test. What it hasn't passed yet is it doesn't have that taste of a hunk of steak, because it doesn't have the tone of the flesh.
Right, because that's muscle.
Right, because it's muscle, and
Right,
it's
and
hard.
that
hard to
cow
act-
has
it-
carried its
right,
heavy self
yeah,
around for a long time.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, even if it couldn't move, it still has a little bit of structure to it, and they're working on that. That's actually one of the issues that they're dealing with, is how to control the texture of it. It's really good. They can make hamburger. They can make all kinds of that kind of thing.
They need to make it calorie-free so that we don't gain weight.
That would be
Could somebody be working on that, please? Calorie-free
There you
ice
go.
cream that's still good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. And maybe
Hey.
that'll come someday. It's just, I don't think it's this week. Although I will say there's a lot more things out there now that are lower cal. And
Yeah, I like my ice cream with as much butterfat as possible. It's a good stuff.
I agree. I like that stuff too. Don't have it often, but I
yes,
do like
no,
it.
not often,
Yeah.
but
And so I think we do need to be responsible and try different things. And I'm thinking back, when I lived in Israel, and I joke and say it's back when the dinosaurs were there. Easy for me to say. It wasn't quite that long ago, but it was at the very beginning of some of the vegan things that are coming out now. And those were only available like in a schnitzel and things that you expected to have that manufactured texture rather than a hunk of meat. And now you can get vegan that pretty much mirrors meat. They've gotten better in that technology too. So, science is a wonderful thing. There's nothing wrong with science. Science is learning how to live nicely in our world, hopefully. Yeah. That's not always, but hopefully that is, it's at least the goal of every scientist that I personally know. So I'll go there. And I know a few. So what can I say? There's lots of things to move forward. And so let's go back and take another look at the Seder, because the Seder is in a lot of ways a chance to ask some of those kinds of questions. It's often called a night of questions.
Monishtana,
Yeah, I was waiting
Mikol
for that.
Halilot.
Which is kind of, why is this night different from all other nights? Right. What's the difference between this night and other nights? And I can tell the joke of, right, the queen is going and looking at a bunch of nights, and they're all done up in beautiful array, and this last one is dirty and rusty and yucky. And she walks up to it and says, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" Yeah. Okay, you can hit me now. Right, but it is a night of questions. Now here, I've got a question for you, Stuart. You can go and look in Talmud, and you might find out that the 4 questions we ask at the Seder now are not the 4 questions that Talmud says should be asked.
Then why are they in the Haggadah?
Very good question. Obviously, the Haggadah although it used the Talmud, made some modifications.
I would guess then, given what the questions are, that the questions in the Haggadah are designed to teach a lesson to the children.
Sometimes you ask the kids and teach the kids something, and you do that so that the adults learn.
Uh-oh.
What can I say? You know, it's something you've been passed a note there, Stuart.
Oh. I'm not used to that. I didn't do that in class.
And so, you know, I certainly
I have
do
to
that.
say, what are the questions?
So there's 4 questions. Cute. So the 4 questions, there's the first overarching question, which is why is this night different from
Okay.
all other nights? The second one asks the question of if on all other nights we eat leavened and unleavened bread, why on this night do we only eat leavened bread? Another question is, on all other nights we do not dip our herbs, but on this night we dip them twice. On all other nights we eat regular herbs and bitter herbs, why on this night do we eat bitter herbs? And on all other nights we eat either erect or reclining, why on this night do we eat reclining? Right, which is, you know, I always loved it as a kid because then I could slump on the table, man, and the parents couldn't say anything, and I made that point to my dad multiple times. I'm just reclining on the seat here. Slumped on the table, because you're supposed to lean, because free people can lean, right? Slaves have to eat standing basically and rushed, and we're supposed to be free. It's a celebration of freedom. And there's 3 reasons for Passover. One is the lambing festival that all shepherds, you know, got to do something with the boy sheep. One is the new wheat, got to get rid of the old wheat. So you've got fresh wheat and you want to bake it and have a celebration. You're not going to let it sit out and rise. And they didn't have Fleischmann's. And now we do. Now we have a new ritual, which is the night after Passover, to take flour that's left over from the matzah that didn't get used and throw yeast in it and rise it and get it out to the restaurants waiting. So that's a popular thing. And then the third theme for Passover, of course, is the time of our freedom, Zman Cherotenu, the time of our liberation. And that is now, since not as many people are farmers and shepherds, you know, have a smaller percentage of the population that does those things in today's world. So the time of freedom is much more the celebration than the farmers and the shepherds.
So what are the Talmudic 4 questions?
You know, that one I'm going to defer until I have a book in front of me. I'm blanking on the one that I wanted to think about, so that I alluded to. I am blanking on it, and I don't have a Talmud here. So otherwise, I would look it up. Sorry about that.
Cliff, get us a Talmud, please.
There you go. Get us a Talmud in the second. Actually, I've got one on my phone, but unfortunately, right now it happens to be.
Well, I can solve that.
You can solve it. You can find it. Good luck
Talmud.
finding it. Yeah, Google Talmud 4 questions Passover. Maybe it'll come up.
Just
There you
Google.
go.
There,
You
just
know,
Google it.
Google it. Yeah, Rabbi Google. When all else fails, and I've used that Rabbi a few times to research things. So, you know, as we discuss it in the ethics class, these technologies change the questions. These technologies change the questions. And the change in our lifestyle changes the questions we have to ask. So at our Seder, we'll be asking a lot of modern questions along with the ancient questions. And some of them are not easy questions. It's, there's not easy answers. There's just interesting questions.
Well, sometimes there are questions that have no answers
That's
yet.
also true.
Yeah.
To be determined.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe never even will.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there are questions that have to be answered very personally and privately and not, in a big public forum. and those kinds of questions come. But it's a night of all kinds of questions. The Seder plate itself, right, the plate that's used is a very ornate, got very specific things in it. There used to be 5 or sometimes 6 separate containers, and there's an egg on it too. There's an egg everywhere in spring. Just imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
Bright colors and eggs. Gotta love spring. And so the idea of the table is that there's so many, interesting things there that you're just naturally inclined to say, well, what's that for? Why is that there? What's behind this? And that is the point of a symposium, of a Roman symposium, excuse me, is to ask those questions, right? To ask the questions and to generate the discussion, because learning and discussions come from questions. They don't come from assertions, right? They don't come from people telling you what they know. They come from people asking questions, because then everybody is exploring and looking, and new knowledge comes out from asking questions. A couple of very famous scientists and doctors will tell you that they were actually raised by their parents with things like, what good questions have you asked? Right? So those kinds of ways of bringing up kids, there we go with nurture, tends to bring a more exploring, learning kind of environment, stimulation.
Well, going back to Google, all of the questions can be answered.
Oh, no, they can't. There's many a stuff I have not found the answer to on Google.
But I mean, if you get a notion, you're like, well, who sang that song from?
Oh, that, yeah.
I mean, but
that
almost,
kind of stuff.
But our kids.
Try
Are
getting
they
a clear
asking-
answer
are
on
they-
the original Talmudic questions.
I'm
I'm now reading about the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud,
Oh, there you go.
and I didn't know there was more than one Talmud, so now I'm really getting lost in the weeds, and that's why we got rabbis.
There's 4 questions, yeah. It's 4 questions. Talmud has 4 too. They're
It
just
says they had
different.
3.
So, and you're right. There's 2 Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud, Yerushalmi, and the Babylonian. And back in the old day, that Jerusalem Talmud was called the Palestinian Talmud, but we won't go there. What can I say? And I can remember as now there are good translations out there of the Jerusalem Talmud. There were not when I was first studying to be a rabbi. And I can remember it was one of the turning points at the bookstore that I used to shop at in Cleveland. There were 2 sets of books that my mentor ordered. And he lived close enough to Cleveland that he would order, when we would study a set of books, he ordered 2 sets, one to be sent to him and one to be sent to me, so that the page numbers when we were studying would match, right? So we could look at the same volume of things. And I remember walking into the bookstore because Reb Shimon had said to them, my student will pick them up. My student will pick up their copy, and just left it at that. And they'll come in and they'll ask for the books that Rabbi Shimon had put aside. And sure enough, I walked in and did that, and yeah, the jaws dropped down and the eyes got wide, and they kind of looked at me and they said, "You're studying those books with Rabbi Shimon?" And I went, "Yeah, it's the next volume on our series." And they looked at me and
They thought you were short?
yeah, they thought I was short. Yeah, they definitely thought I was a little on the short side. But I'll tell you that after that, I now can shop at that store and I do not get questioned about anything. And they've been extremely helpful. So they did a paradigm shift, right? They realized, and I'll give them a lot of credit. Right? They did not allow their prejudice and their stereotype of women to govern. The stereotype of the scholar came in and overrode it.
Well, I told you, I guess I've done a paradigm shift. I mean,
Yeah.
look, I do discrimination law and civil rights, but when you first took the BEMA at the old temple. That's the new rabbi.
You're
And I'm sitting in the back because I don't want to be near the front and have to be involved and just sitting in the back. And I see you.
I'm a little short.
I'm being honest.
And you
I've told you the story. I'm looking and saying, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. That's supposed to be a man, preferably with a beard.
Oy.
Hey. And it was a
my
shock
beard.
to the conscience.
I stroke my beard
And,
periodically.
of course, here I am, how many years later? I don't know, 4, 6, 7 years later. And, I'll follow you to the ends of the earth.
Well, thank you. I stroke
Even
my
though I don't always agree with you.
I understand, and you shouldn't, right? Following a rabbi doesn't mean you always agree. In fact, some of the biggest learning for both of us happens when we don't agree, because then we both go back and look more and come back and discuss it again, not necessarily agreeing again. But thank you for being willing to share that as a discrimination lawyer, you still had some of that stereotyping.
Absolutely, and I didn't realize it until
Prejudice,
you showed
discrimination.
up, and it was just, no, this isn't right.
But we get used to the certain order of things, and that isn't really the order that it was for you ever.
But there are
She was
also
supposed to be
certain
a man.
occupations that, as you grow up, are gender stereotyped. Okay, a rabbi is a man. A flight attendant, then called a stewardess, was a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, nurses were women.
Mm-hmm.
Plumbers
Firefighters
were men.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the way it is anymore. Nor should it be.
Nor should it be, right.
But even even though if somebody came in and I heard they were discriminating against a man or a woman for one reason or another, I could identify it, I could deal with it legally. But here I showed up, and I was like, no, that's not right.
Yeah, and the question is, would that have affected your hiring if you were on the hiring committee?
No, well, I think I would have reacted the same way I did as a congregant. It would have been a little bit of a shock to the system.
Yeah.
I would have listened to you, and in only a little bit of time, it would have become more of a natural progression. I don't mean to trivialize it, but it's almost like all these remakes they do of the TV shows now.
Yeah.
That I really like. Magnum PI, Hawaii Five-0.
Do you like the new Magnum?
Yeah, I do. But the first time you watch it or the second time you watch it, you're thinking in your head of the old characters, and it's like.
I always just go, why can't they come up with something new?
Okay, but that's a different issue. But my point is, after an episode or two, you begin to identify with this is Magnum. Not Tom Selleck, okay? This is Dano.
It's kind of like the James Bonds when they change to different guys.
I always change. That's different. That's always.
Yeah, that's a spy.
But you begin to adjust, and you forget the old, and you adapt to the new. Here, it wasn't forgetting the old. I mean, there's still plenty of male rabbis, but it was accepting the fact that there's no rational reason that the rabbi has to be a man. I mean, it's.
You didn't know that these were really payout there. See, I can twirl them just fine. There you go. See, I can make them look just. Yeah, well, I can do that too. I can look just like a. That's really all the hair that it is. It's just that wonderfully misbehaving first lock. Thank you.
Just don't work on the beard.
Don't do the beard.
No, no.
I sometimes stroke it. It's a virtual.
I think one day you should come in with one of the Santa Claus beards that you put on.
Yes, the joys of it all. I guess
Speaking of Passover.
Yeah, speaking of Passover, yeah. What was coming to my mind was, part of, speaking of discrimination, part of the inspection protocol in the military, when you were being inspected and they had this little checklist, did airmen shave today?
No,
and I was
today.
like, I'm not showing you the parts that I shaved. So yeah, for you to check. Just take my word for it. We're in good shape. So stereotypes, right? Because military is one of the places where, for a while, it was more restricted, and some of those are still in the process of breaking down. We haven't broken down all the stereotypes and all of the discrimination and restrictions. But yeah, you don't even have to be a rabbi to lead a Seder, but it certainly helps you draw on things. You know, there's the amount of study. I think a lot of people don't realize how much study goes in to a rabbi coming out of one of the main seminaries. So HUC, Aleph, where I came from, JTS, those the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, those programs. There's AJR. There's a number of, and most of those programs are 5 years after college. And so they're 5-year graduate study programs with Hebrew language requirements and all of the other things. Now, is it possible that somebody gets ordination a different way? Yeah, you know, you can pay $25. I'm not even sure you pay $25 anymore on the internet. You can become whatever you want to call yourself.
Just call me Rabbi Shmuel.
There you go. You know, and I can't tell you, you know, a number of people have, even in Port St. Lucie, I've actually had people come to me and say, well, I'm ordained as a rabbi. And I'm like, really? Tell me more about your school. Mm-hmm. You know, because you can pick up the certificate online, and the real goal behind that was to allow people to be able to do weddings, because a lot of states require that a marriage officiant be a clergy, and so these quickie online ordinations, you know, and they let you pick what denomination you want and what title you want to go with it by the. And since the laws are such that they can't stop that, it's the temple of universal life.
It really
or something.
cheapens it, doesn't it?
Yes,
Because
it
it's
does.
the same way you can get a certificate for your dog to be a therapy dog.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's
It
cheapens.
It cheapens the system.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so I will tell you that when I was on the board of rabbis in Tucson, we were very restrictive on who was allowed on the board of rabbis. You had to come out of one of those schools. You had to be associated with a national movement. And you know, there were a number of criteria that we used so that those individuals could not say, well, I'm a member of the Board of Rabbis. Because we didn't want them to have that hechsher. We didn't want them to have that certification. Because it does matter.
Mm-hmm.
And where I see the biggest difference is obviously, you know, like being able to reference, even if I can't pull up the reference right at the moment, if I were sitting in my office, I could do it because I'd have Talmud there. I'd have it on the computer, not just on the phone on which I'm live streaming, so I can't look it up. But those kinds of things, right? I would have more of a flexibility of doing, of actually reading the answer and looking at it and being able to work through it. That somebody who hasn't done that amount of study just doesn't have that kind of referenceability to really anchor the stuff and tell you where they find it and why they find it and be able to do a scholarly response. So the other thing that, you know, like in my rabbinical school, I had to go through an extensive training. I had to go through a psychological screening. There was a ton of stuff that you had to go through that wasn't just class stuff. You know, some of it was practical rabbinics. Practical rabbinics are how do you arrange the chairs in the sanctuary? Because you need to know that. And I will say that the way that we arrange them in our sanctuary has an effect on how the service feels. And it's that kind of dynamic. So you learn all kinds of things that you might not otherwise expect. And, yeah.
Now, I have a question. You mentioned that sometimes the 4 questions are meant to teach a lesson to the adults. What were you talking about? What lesson?
It varies. Right? So, you know, well, what does it mean to be free? Right? Sometimes adults need to be asked that question. Right? We've got adults who aren't free. Right? If your work is such that you don't have any free time, you're always working, you're not free. Right? If you can't come to Shabbat because of work, you're not free. Right. Now, are you free to leave whatever employment you have and change the situation? Possibly. Possibly not. There might be somebody who has control on you. And so we get to raise some of those questions. We raise the questions of, what's the meaning of bitter herbs? Why is romaine a really good bitter herb? Because most people think of horseradish. Horseradish is not bitter, it's sharp. It's not bitter. But romaine, especially the older leaves, is bitter.
Now, when I used to go to the ultra-Orthodox Seders as a kid,
Uh-huh.
because one of my father's closest friends was very Orthodox, and his two kids went to yeshiva. They had somebody there who would always eat horseradish until they were purple in the face and the tears were streaming. And the lesson I remember from that was the reason they did it was to have the tears streaming down their face to remember what slavery was like.
Yeah.
So didn't the horseradish serve a purpose then?
It serves a purpose, and that's
It gives you a runny nose.
gives you, yeah. So what I'm thinking about with that, right, is really a sidebar, and I'm gonna say that in some ways misses a mark, and I'll tell you why. Our bodies expunge toxins when we cry emotionally. They do not expunge those toxins when we cry because we're cutting onions. And so, I'm not sure that
Those are
somebody who
different
eats enough.
tears.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not sure that somebody who eats enough horseradish to cry really understands slavery. Okay, I think they're doing a show of tears, and I'm not sure they're really getting it. I know that one of the reasons that we moved to horseradish was availability of foodstuffs in ancient Europe, and not so ancient, in a few hundred years ago in Europe. And right, so those folks who were a little further south stayed with romaine, which is why there's now Seder place with 6, because one of the dishes is for romaine specifically, as an alternative bitter herb. And romaine's a really important one, and I'm going to try to get a piece of it in your mouth and let you chew on it. Let's see. He doesn't.
My food thing doesn't start till May 7th.
Okay. So, romaine's a really interesting lettuce. Most people don't think of it as being a bitter herb until you really chew on an older leaf for a while. And the longer you chew, the more bitter it becomes. And that was the point of the discussion about slavery. What kind of slavery was the 400 and some years? And first of all, not all 400 years in Egypt were slavery. A good chunk of them were, as Joseph's special folks who had special dispensation. It's not until the Pharaoh arises who knew not Joseph that it gets harder and harder. But it's basically the kind of slavery that we're talking about biblically is not the model that America used in its early shaping. It's more that of undocumented workers who are not as free to do what they want to do, and they live their lives in fear and all of that. It's basically an undocumented worker kind of status. It's a second class, maybe third class of people that have to do the yuck jobs because nobody else, those are the jobs that nobody else will take. So, somebody looks the other way and hires somebody. And Al is saying to you, yes, it does matter, the 4 questions and confirmation bias. So, so we're invited to think about what does that mean, and we're invited to think about what does it mean to be on the periphery of society, like the LGBTQ community, right? Why are they not accepted into the mainstream? Because what you do in the privacy of your home is your business. And, I'm not saying that, anybody should do a public display on the front yard of anything. I don't want to see either kind. I don't want to see any kind. Right? Because it's just, that doesn't belong there. And then that might be a prejudice of its own. I'm getting chuckles over on Facebook here. I can remember once at an amusement park having a fairly young couple in front of a group of us, and they were a little bit more demonstrative than most, let's put it that way. And I can remember thinking in my mind, okay, I know what that is. I raise dogs. Right, I know when somebody's in heat.
In other words, get a room.
Yeah, yeah. There were places that and that does raise the question of how much is appropriate, and that's a cultural thing. How much affection can be shown publicly, and how much not, and even families within America vary widely on what's considered acceptable and what's not. But beyond that, if you're achieving that public, non-demonstrative status, who cares when you get past that? That as long as everybody is consenting to what's happening, it's consent. Right, Counselor?
Well, I could play devil's advocate. Does that mean that if you do it in the privacy of your own home, there should be no laws against bestiality?
What's bestiality?
Sex with an animal.
Okay. Can you guarantee that the animal has consented? Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. You don't have sex with a minor because a minor can't consent or not consent.
Well,
And that's just really
the
wrong
lamb
on so
went
many levels.
meh.
That's wrong on so many levels, right? And you're not going to convince me that some of the guys that do that it doesn't hurt the animal. You're just not going to convince me that biologically that a human penis is going to fit in the right place and be pleasurable for the recipient. So that's the issue.
Think of all the creepy things you can catch, too.
Oh, and pass on to the next person with whom you have regular.
I was more worried about the animal. No.
I understand. So, no, I don't think that. I think that falls under the category of you're not consenting adults. Right, a sheep or a cow is not a consenting adult.
That sort of goes against nature, too. That is not really the way it was meant.
One adult consent to be killed.
Can one adult consent to be killed? All right, so now we're going to go over into facilitated euthanasia.
Well, this is the Socratic method that I was taught.
The Socratic method of imbibing oleander?
What?
Or not oleander, hemlock, rather.
Well, I mean, it's if what
Same
two consenting adults do in the privacy of their own home, what if one is, okay, let's deal with euthanasia, which is near the end, even my views have modified, but, let's say it's just a lot of pain, but it's not really the kind of pain that you would consider for euthanasia, but one says, please, just do it, get me out of my misery.
The challenge becomes, when does the person really consent, and how do you know that consent has been given? Now that starts to get a little hairier, right? Because if Joe and Irma have this agreement that one's going to shoot the other, then you need to be able to document that extremely, extremely well, because otherwise you're going to have Joe claiming that Irma said that, and no proof that Irma did.
Oh, let's assume it's fully documented.
Will it even hold up? If you give permission, you're
well, under
still
the laws it won't, but
right.
That's not the question.
Well,
Okay.
you're not allowed to suicide yourself either. That's still illegal.
But that's a law.
Yeah.
You were talking about two consenting adults.
I'm talking about relations
Okay.
between two adults.
I will then defer.
I'm not talking about everything else that you can or not do. So, yeah. All right. Leave it to Stuart to find the weird corner out of it. So, and somebody here said, "My sweet embraceable you."
that can't be about me because there's only one person.
No,
who
it's
can say that.
EWE.
Okay.
Sweet embraceable you.
I just have to say one more thing.
All right.
Echecho.
Egg kichel is what he was trying to say. It's egg. It's a kind of a cookie thing. That comes out because there's limits to what you can and can't bake and prepare. You can't make an oatmeal cookie, a chocolate chip cookie during Passover. Not that there aren't plenty of other things to eat, and I usually gain about 3 pounds every Passover. But, in 8 days, that's pretty amazing. It's called this huge volume of matzah, and because you can put anything and everything on the matzah.
When the matzah goes in, it doesn't necessarily come out.
Yeah, especially when you heap it full of charoset. Charoset is one of the ritual foods, and basically the recipe for it comes out of the Song of Songs. So it's almonds and raisins and wine and or grape juice in our case. We don't make it with wine. But all things wonderful, dates, figs, apples, lots of different fruit. And it tastes rather yummy, and you can put that on the matzah, and So,
Echecho.
yeah, I'll let you have the egg kichel, and I'll have the matzah. I like just a plain sheet of matzah with that or with butter, depending on the charoset if it's a meat thing, and the butter if it's not a meat time. So, there's an old habit too. Because what can I say? So we're down to 2 minutes, and you folks have not called in this week, so please call in next week to Ask a Rabbi. I will leave, though, with another invitation to please do check out our website, and if you're even curious about what a Seder is, please feel free to join us. You can register online at www.eitzchayim.org. And you can go to where it says Passover reservations here. We know it works because we've got people who've done it, so it should work for you if you go
Do you
there.
have like limited space or anything, or is there?
It is limited space, so yeah, people do need to get their reservations in. We're in a bigger space than we were last year, so we can take some more people. We haven't figured it out to the last nit of fitting in, but we're in a significantly bigger, more open space. So, so it'll be a good thing. We will not be having services at our normal location on Friday night and the following Saturday. So the Seder is not this Friday, but next Friday. Next Friday I'll be going thoroughly insane. And who knows what discussions we'll have. And we'll go from there. So this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb from Congregation Eitz Chayim. Thank you.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.